They came for her hair at midnight. The two women Hortense had hired for the occasion held Susanna's arms against the chair, while Hortense herself opened the tin of black dye she'd had sent from town 3 days prior, before the Duke's letter had even been read twice. She had been preparing this, Susanna understood now, for longer than one afternoon. The white streak ran from above Susanna's left temple down through her dark hair, 2 inches wide and straight as a part. The same streak her mother had worn, and her mother's mother before that, and the grandmother whose portrait hung in oil above the parlor fireplace. 3 generations of Pryce women, all marked the same. It was not a flaw. The servants had always called it the Pryce mark, said in the way people name something they half believe is blessed. Hortense did not believe in blessings. She believed in advantage, and the white streak was an advantage she intended to remove before morning. "Hold her still," she said, and Susanna felt the cold brush drag across her scalp. She did not cry out. 6 years in this house had taught her that crying out accomplished nothing except to make Hortense feel she had won something. So she sat, eyes fixed on the wallpaper pattern she'd memorized at age 12, and felt the dye go in. When it was done, Hortense stepped back and looked at her work with the expression of a woman settling accounts. She leaned down close, and Susanna smelled lavender and the sharper scent of the dye, and Hortense said 5 words very quietly, as if to herself. "He will not know her." Then she straightened, handed the brush to one of the hired women, and walked out. Susanna sat in the chair for a long time after that. The white was gone. Her reflection in the small mirror on the bureau showed a stranger. All dark hair, unremarkable, no mark at all. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and let the words go around in her head until they wore grooves. He will not know her. Who, and what was it, exactly, that he must not know? The Duke of Keswick arrived the following day at 11:30, which was 20 minutes earlier than Hortense had accounted for, and the scramble on the front steps showed it. Dorinda's curl was still being pinned when the carriage appeared at the end of the drive. 4 gray horses, a crest on the door, a silver hawk on a field of dark green. Susanna watched from the scullery window, because that was the only window she was permitted to use. Her orders had been given before breakfast. She was to serve at table that evening, stay out of sight the remainder of the day, not speak unless spoken to, and if spoken to, answer in as few words as possible, and absent herself immediately. "You are the scullery girl," Hortense had said, "not the daughter of this house. If you forget that, even for a moment, the situation I have arranged for you in the city becomes available much sooner than planned." The situation in the city. Hortense had mentioned it twice now and elaborated neither time, and both times the phrase had settled in Susanna's chest like a stone dropped in cold water. She watched the Duke step down from the carriage. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, perhaps a year or 2 either side, with dark hair and the kind of economical stillness that suggested a man who had spent years learning not to show what he was thinking. He bowed to Hortense with exactly the courtesy required, and not a fraction more. He shook Dorinda's gloved hand. His eyes moved over the front of the house the way a man's eyes move when he is cataloging something rather than admiring it. For half a moment they found the scullery window. Susanna stepped back so fast she knocked the copper pot from its hook behind her. He hadn't seen her. Men, like the Duke of Keswick, did not look into scullery windows. She told herself this and went back to work. The story of Ronan Keswick, though Susanna would not learn most of it until much later, pieced together in the library with the winter light going gray, and his voice rough with telling, had begun 7 years ago in a December storm outside the village of Hawick. He had been 23. His father's investment in a northern rail venture had collapsed 6 weeks earlier, taking with it most of what remained of the Keswick fortune, and Ronan had spent the preceding month riding between creditors and solicitors in weather that seemed personally offended by him. The storm that overtook him 2 miles from Hawick was the worst of the season. His horse went lame in the ice, and he had stood on that roadside in the driving snow, watching 2 hired carriages pass him without slowing, and felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with weather. A farm gig had stopped. The girl driving it, she had taken the reins from the elderly man beside her, apparently on impulse, had come down into the snow to help him without being asked. She hadn't spoken much. She'd helped him to the seat with practical hands, sent the old man to walk at the horse's head, and then sat beside Ronan under a lap blanket that smelled of hay and wood smoke, while the gig made its slow way toward shelter. He had been too exhausted and too ashamed to say very much. She had not seemed to require it. What he remembered afterward, the lamp swinging at the gig's side, casting its small circle of yellow light across the snow. Her hands on the reins, steady, the way she did not look at him with pity, but with the same calm attention she gave the road, and her hair, dark, wet from the snow that had blown under her hood, and through it that stripe of white, vivid as a seam of quartz in dark stone, catching the lamplight and holding it. He had asked her name. The wind had taken it. He had asked again, and she had said something that might have been the name of the estate rather than her own. He could not be certain, and then they had reached the posting inn at the edge of the village, and she had pressed something into his hand as she helped him down. A brass compass, small, dented with initials scratched inside the case. AP over SP, her father's and hers. "Keep it," she said. "You need it more than I do tonight. Return it when you find your way." He had written to the Pryce estate 3 weeks later, when the roads cleared, and the first measure of the family fortune had been, against all expectation, recovered. He had enclosed the compass and a letter of thanks. He had received no reply. He had written twice more. Silence. He had hired men to look into it eventually, because Ronan Keswick was a man who did not let debts go unpaid and did not forget favors. The men he hired found that Arthur Pryce had died 5 years past, leaving the estate to a widow's management. Beyond that, the household was closed to inquiry. His father's solicitor had also found an old letter written in the last weeks of Arthur Pryce's life, a pledge between friends, the Pryce daughter and the Keswick heir when the time was right. A debt of honor, his father had called it. Pryce had refused money. He had asked instead for this, a promise. Ronan had come to the estate to find both things at once. He had told himself they might be the same thing. He was not yet certain that they were. The dinner table that evening was set with china. Susanna had not seen since her father's last birthday supper. She had spent the afternoon polishing it, working around the footman, who kept checking the placement of the silver, and had let herself notice, only briefly, how the crest on each plate matched the crest above the front hall door. The Pryce hawk, rendered in blue and gilt. Hortense had not sold the china. She had known, Susanna thought, that she might need it one day. Susanna carried the soup tureen in at 8 o'clock, with her eyes down, her hair pulled flat under a cap, and took her place at the sideboard. The conversation at the table began with the weather, moved to the difficulty of northern roads, and settled eventually into Hortense's preferred territory. Dorinda, her accomplishments, her disposition, her perfectly adequate constitution. Dorinda smiled and blushed at intervals that had been rehearsed so thoroughly. They had almost stopped looking rehearsed. The Duke ate little. He answered questions in sentences that closed rather than opened. His eyes moved around the room in that cataloging way Susanna had noticed from the scullery window, taking inventory of everything, assigning each thing its place. He noticed her twice. The first time was when she poured the wine, and her hand was unsteady for 1/2 second, no more, though she could not have said why. He looked at the decanter, and then at her face, and then away, in the time it takes to blink. The second time came between the main course and the sweet. Dorinda had been sent to the piano, just a little something. He is fond of music. Hortense had murmured before dinner with the focused warmth of a woman directing artillery, and was playing creditably through a piece she had drilled all week. Hortense was watching the Duke watch Dorinda. The Duke was not watching Dorinda. He was watching the parlor wall. Susanna followed his gaze before she could stop herself. The portrait of her mother looked back at them both from its gilt frame. Margaret Pryce, painted the summer before Susanna was born, laughing-eyed, dark-haired, and through the dark hair, unmistakable, painted with fine, careful strokes by an artist who had understood what he was seeing. The white streak, bright as bone. Susanna looked away. Don't, she thought, uselessly, at a man she had never spoken to. Please don't look at it. Dorinda finished her piece. Hortense applauded. The Duke set down his glass. "Mrs. Fallow," he said, and the room quieted in a way it hadn't for anyone else all evening, the way rooms quiet when something is about to shift. "The lady in that portrait." He nodded toward the wall, unhurried, precise. "The white in her hair, it is hereditary, I believe, in some families. Does either of your daughters share it?" The question dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Susanna's hands on the serving cloth went very still. Hortense's face did not change. Later, thinking about it, Susanna would recognize this as the most frightening thing, not a flicker, not a hesitation. The trap door closed without a sound. "What a thing to notice," Hortense said warmly, turning to the portrait with an expression of rehearsed nostalgia. "That is my own mother, painted in her young years. The mark, yes, it runs in her family, not mine. Dorinda has not inherited it, I'm afraid." A small, fond sigh. "We had hoped." He looked at the portrait a moment longer. "A pity. The coloring is striking." "Isn't it?" Hortense agreed. "Dorinda has her father's looks entirely. Quite different. Though I confess I sometimes wished she'd taken the mark. Everyone remarked on it in my mother's day." Susanna stood at the sideboard with the cloth pressed against her ribs and understood 3 things simultaneously. So fast they arrived as one. The Duke had come here looking for the white streak, not for a portrait, for the streak itself on a living person. It was her streak, her mother's streak. The Pryce mark, passed down through blood, the same blood that made this house hers. And it was gone, dyed black by a woman who had known, 7 years ago, or 7 months, or perhaps from the very first letter, what it would mean when this man came to the door. He will not know her. Susanna set down the cloth very carefully. She thought, "He is 10 feet from me. He is looking for me. He has no idea." Mrs. Kell came to Susanna's room at midnight, which was the second extraordinary thing that had happened in 12 hours. The first being that Susanna had managed not to drop anything during dinner. The housekeeper was 63 and had served in the house since Susanna's father was a boy. She came in without knocking, which was the privilege of 28 years' service, and set a cup of warm milk on the windowsill and stood looking at Susanna's dyed hair for a long, unspeaking moment. "He asked me this afternoon," Mrs. Kell said finally, "which servants had been in this house longer than 10 years. She did not sit. She held her hands at her waist in the way she always had, composed as packed earth. He asked which rooms were kept closed. He asked whether the estate held portraits of the previous family." Susanna wrapped her hands around the cup. "Mrs. Kell, I am not here to put words in your mouth." The housekeeper cut her off gently. "I am here because I was there the morning you were born, and I watched that woman downstairs sit at your father's table tonight and claim your grandmother's face as her own, and I have a long memory and old knees and less to lose than I used to." She paused. "That man is not here to marry a girl he has never met. He is here looking for something, and whatever it is, it has your mother's mark on it." Susanna was quiet for a moment. "He won't find it now." Mrs. Kell looked at her with the expression she had worn throughout Susanna's childhood, the one that said she knew the full weight of what she was about to say. "There are two things in this house that remember the truth. One is that portrait on the parlor wall." She moved toward the door. "The other one is me." The stairs creaked under her going, and Susanna was alone. She lay on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about 7 years, and a white streak dyed black, and a man who had come all this way to ask one question at a dinner table. And then she thought about the compass. It lived in the false bottom of her wooden trunk, the one Mrs. Kell had shown her how to make the winter after her father died, when Hortense had begun her inventory of the house's contents. The compass was small, dented, old. She had had it since she was 7, when her father had scratched her initials beneath his inside the case. She had lost it once, terrifyingly, in a December storm 7 years ago. Given it to a stranger half frozen on the roadside, because he had needed it more than she did in that moment, and she had never been good at keeping things back when someone needed them. 3 weeks later, a parcel had come to the house addressed to the young lady of the Pryce household. She had never received it. Hortense had been managing the post by then. The compass she kept in the trunk was not the one she had given away. It was a different one, her father's, the older one. She had 2. She had given the stranger her own and kept her father's. She sat up in the dark. He said he would return it. He had tried. She was almost certain now, with the cold clarity of midnight, that he had tried. The library was Susanna's last piece of Pryce Hall that still felt like hers. Hortense had sold the atlas and the law books and anything leather-bound that looked expensive, but she had left the rest because books bored her, and the library was north-facing and cold, and so it had become Susanna's task to dust the shelves, and Susanna had made the task last as long as she dared. She was there the next morning, working the high shelves with the feather duster, when she heard the door open. The Duke stood in the entrance, looking at the shelves with the expression of a man who reads. He had a book in one hand already, the estate's old Burrell on land management, which lived on the second shelf beside the window. "You shelved this morning," he said. She hadn't. She had shelved it last Tuesday and every Tuesday before that for 3 years. But she understood what he was asking. "I look after the library, Your Grace." "You put its spine out without looking." He gestured to the shelf she had just left. "And before that, you shelved the Burkett correspondence behind the ledger books, not in front of them." Susanna kept her face still. "The previous owner kept his correspondence private, Your Grace. I keep his arrangement." "The previous owner," he repeated. "Mr. Pryce." She did not look at him. He was a careful man. A silence, then carefully. "Did you know him?" The answer rose in her throat with the force of everything she had held down for 6 years. She pressed her teeth together and said, "Everyone in this house knew Mr. Pryce, Your Grace. He was kind." "Kind," the Duke said. He was watching her with the same stillness from the dinner table, and Susanna felt it the way you feel weather before it turns, not frightening exactly, but important, the way some silences are. "The compass," he said then, and her heart went completely still. "The one sent back to this house 3 weeks after I left Hawick. Did it arrive?" Susanna turned to face him. She had not meant to. It happened the way things happen when your body makes a decision before your mind has caught up. The Duke was looking at her. Not at her cap, not at her apron, not at the composed surface she had spent years perfecting. At her face. The way you look at something you have been trying to solve for a long time and have just, possibly, found the last piece of Your Grace, she started. The library door opened. Hortense stood in it. The sweep of her eyes took in the room, the distance between them, the book still in the Duke's hand, Susanna's expression. And Susanna watched the calculation happen in the space of a breath. Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. Dorinda has been asking for you. She's found the most charming piece of sheet music, and then the honey hardening to something else entirely. Susanna, cook is waiting. The store cupboard won't organize itself. Susanna curtsied. She did not look at the Duke again. But as she passed through the door, she heard him say behind her pleasantly, the pleasantness of a man with all his pieces now in place. Mrs. Fallow, you've never introduced her properly. The girl's name is Susanna, is it? The pause before Hortense answered was 3 seconds long. Susanna counted them in the hallway, her back to the closed door, and understood that something had just shifted in the house irrevocably, though she could not yet see in which direction it would fall. Hortense acted that same evening. She always acted quickly once she felt the ground move. Susanna was summoned to the sitting room after the household had retired. Hortense sat at her writing desk and did not look up for a full minute, and Susanna stood in the middle of the carpet and waited, because 6 years had also taught her that waiting was not the same as losing. When Hortense finally put down her pen, her voice was calm as packed snow. You have been noticed, she said. That is a problem. There is a cloth manufactory in the Eastern Quarter, respectable, always in need of capable girls. You will go tomorrow night, after the house is asleep. The carriage comes at 11. You will tell no one. Not the kitchen, not the footman. She paused. Not Mrs. Kell. Susanna opened her mouth. Hortense raised one hand. If you are thinking of speaking to His Grace before you go, remember that a scullery girl's word carries very little against that of the woman who manages the estate, particularly when that woman holds the late Mr. Pryce's will and the goodwill of every solicitor in 3 counties. You are clever enough to understand your position. She picked up her pen. That will be all. There was almost nothing to pack. 6 years in her father's house, and what remained fit in a box a child could carry. 2 work dresses, her mother's Bible, the bundle of letters in her father's hand, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a scrap of wool, the brass compass with his initials over hers. She lifted it out and held it in her palm in the candlelight. Small, dented, older than she was, AP scratched inside the case, her father's initials, and below them smaller, shakier, SP her own. She had given the stranger her compass in the snow 7 years ago. The stranger had tried to return it. Hortense had taken it from the post and kept it in her desk drawer for 7 years, which meant she had known all along what it represented, and had held it away from Susanna the same way she had held away everything else, methodically, without malice, the way a person removes an obstacle from a path they have decided belongs to them. She wrapped her father's compass in brown paper, the older one AP only, no SP, and knocked on Mrs. Kell's door before the candle burned down. The housekeeper opened it in her nightcap, took one look at Susanna's face, and stood back without a word. They're sending me away, Susanna said. I'm not supposed to tell you. So I'm not telling you. I'm only leaving something in your keeping. She held out the parcel. It belonged to a man who tried to return something of mine, she said, and never received word that it arrived. If he asks about a compass with a girl's initials inside, if he ever asks, give him this. And tell him the Pryce daughter said the debt was paid long ago, and she never minded the storm. Mrs. Kell looked at the parcel for a long time. Her hands, when she finally took it, were not steady. Where are they sending you? She asked. A manufactory in the East Quarter. Susanna paused, and the pause had the same cold weight as every time Hortense had mentioned it. I don't know the address. I don't know the street. Above them in the guest corridor, a floorboard creaked, the sound of a man who could not sleep, pacing in the dark one floor above them both. They came for her at 11, as promised. Hortense did not come herself. She sent the coachman and a sealed note with a destination on it. Nothing warm, no address for correspondence, no pretense of the thing being anything other than what it was. Susanna carried her own trunk down the back stairs and did not allow herself to look at the parlor as she passed. She could not help looking up, briefly, at the portrait visible through the doorway. Her mother in the gilt frame, laughing-eyed, the white streak bright even in the half-dark. She lifted her hand once, very slightly, and went out. Mrs. Kell waited one full day and one full night, because she was old and careful, and because the moment you act on insufficient certainty is the moment everything you mean to protect falls down. On the second morning, she climbed the stairs to the Duke's rooms on her creaking knees, carrying the brown paper parcel, and did the most dangerous thing of her long career in this house. She set it on the table by the window and stood beside it and waited to be found. Ronan came in at 7:30, still in the dark coat from his early walk, and stopped when he saw her. Then he saw what was on the table. He crossed the room slowly. The way you move towards something you are not certain is real. He opened the parcel. He opened the compass case. Inside AP, a man's initials. "There are two of them," Mrs. Kell said. Her voice did not waver, though her hands, clasped at her waist, were not entirely steady. "She kept her father's. She gave you her own, with her own initials inside it, the one you sent back 3 weeks after Hawick. I watched Mrs. Fallow take it from the post myself. It went into her writing desk. I said nothing for 7 years because I valued my position." She paused. "I am saying it now because that child was put in a carriage 2 nights ago for a cloth manufactory in the East Quarter, and I watched her lights go down the drive, and I have stopped valuing my position." Ronan stood very still. "Her name," he said. "Susanna Pryce, daughter of Arthur Pryce, born in the room across this landing." Mrs. Kell's chin came up. "She has her mother's mark. Had it. Before Mrs. Fallow dyed it out the night before your arrival, the white in the portrait. It was on the girl standing at your sideboard with the decanter. You looked at her and did not know her, because the only thing you were looking for had been taken from her head, while 2 women held her arms in the dark. The room was entirely quiet. Somewhere downstairs, the hall clock measured the silence. "Which manufactory?" Ronan said. Mrs. Kell told him. She was still speaking when she heard the door. He found her in the manufactory yard during the morning half-hour of air, a gray courtyard between high walls where the workers walked in circuits, heads bent against the November cold. Susanna stood apart at the far end beside the iron fence, looking up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings, with a stillness he recognized before he recognized anything else about her. He had spent 7 years looking for a white streak. He had hired men, matched descriptions, followed wrong roads across 4 counties. And now he stood in a cloth manufactory yard in the East Quarter of a northern city and knew her instantly, without the streak, without the mark, without a single feature he could have named in a deposition. He knew her the way you know the shape of a room you grew up in the dark. She turned when she heard his boots on the cobbles. She went very still. Then she curtsied, the deep automatic curtsy of 6 years' habit, her eyes down, her whole body already bracing. "Your Grace," she said, "if Mrs. Fallow has sent you to—" "Mrs. Fallow has sent me nowhere," Ronan said. "I sent myself." She looked up then. He let her look. He stood in the gray yard, in his plain dark coat, and let her read whatever she needed to read in his face. And then he took from inside his coat the compass she had pressed into his hand on a roadside in the snow 7 years past. Her breath went out of her. She looked at it, and then at him, with the expression of someone attempting to reconcile two things that should not be able to exist in the same place. "The Ford," she said, "the man at the Ford." "The same one," he said. "You were half frozen." "Entirely frozen," he agreed. "And you came out into the snow when two hired carriages had just gone past without stopping, and you gave me your seat, and you gave me this, and you told me to return it when I found my way." She shook her head slowly. "I gave that to a poor man in a storm." "You did." He held it out to her, "and I am returning it." She took it. She held it in both hands and looked down at her own initials inside the case. SP, scratched smaller and shakier than her father's, and her face did something he had not yet seen it do in 2 days of watching from a careful distance. The composure held, but something underneath it changed, the way ice changes when the temperature finally shifts, before it breaks. She pressed one hand over her mouth for a moment. Then she breathed. "You kept it," she said quietly, "all that time." "I keep things given in good faith." He offered his hand, not to shake, simply to hold, the way you offer a hand to someone who has been standing alone for a long time in the cold. I was also looking for the person who gave it, but it seemed indelicate to lead with that. A sound came from her then, not quite a laugh, not quite not one. "Miss Pryce," he said, "will you come home?" The story of what happened at Pryce Hall in the weeks that followed became the kind of story that countess tell for a generation. Not because it was extraordinary, though it was that, but because so many people had been in the rooms where it happened and could not stop telling it. Mrs. Kell told it. The cook told it. The footman, who had been in the hallway when Ronan Keswick returned with a young woman in a gray manufactory apron and walked her through the front door of her own house and stopped her beneath the parlor portrait, told it for 30 years, and his voice went rough every time. He stood her under her mother's picture, that footman would say, and he turned to the whole household. Every servant, because he'd rung the bell himself, and he said, "This is Susanna Pryce, daughter of Arthur and Margaret Pryce, and you are standing in her father's house. I believe some of you have not forgotten it. I am asking the rest of you to remember it now." Dorinda had come forward on her own, unprompted, white-faced, while Hortense stood in the corner of the hall and found that the authority which had made her word law for 6 years had, in the space of an afternoon, simply ceased. Dorinda said, in a voice that shook only a little, that she had not known about the manufactory until it was done. She said she was sorry. She said it to Susanna, not to the room. Susanna, who had spent the carriage ride back from the eastern quarter, staring out the window with the compass closed in her fist, and thinking about what she was and was not prepared to carry forward, looked at Dorinda for a long moment and said, "I know. I believe you." Hortense left before the first snow. The solicitors found sufficient irregularity in 6 years of estate accounts to ensure she left quietly and without the dignity she had maintained at considerable expense to others. Susanna declined to pursue further legal action, on the grounds that she had no interest in spending the remainder of her young years in courtrooms with a woman she had already spent too long in rooms with. The county settled the matter in its own way, through drawing rooms and church pews and market-day conversations, and the county's verdict was thorough and without appeal. There is no second season for a woman found out in a place she has built entirely on performance. Dorinda stayed. It surprised people, and perhaps surprised Dorinda most of all. She stayed because Susanna told her she could, and because she had learned in one terrible evening what her mother's methods cost, and because learning something that clearly, that publicly, rearranges a person in ways that are difficult to undo. She was not easy, and she was not quick, and there were months when the air between her and Susanna held the weight of everything that had been done and not undone. But she was honest, after those first raw weeks, in the uncomfortable way of people who have recently discovered why honesty matters. And Susanna, who had spent 6 years learning to notice what people actually did rather than what they said, noticed this and counted it for something. The price mark grew back through the winter, the dye washing out week by week until by February the white streak was visible again, an inch of it, then 2, running from her left temple through the dark hair the way it always had. The servants left small encouraging comments about it in the kitchen. Mrs. Kell said nothing, but her expression the morning she first noticed it. Coming in fully was the expression of someone watching something return to where it belonged. Ronan came every week from his own estate, half a day's ride east. They sat in the library in the north light and told each other everything. He, the ruin and the slow recovery, and the 7 years of searches that ended nowhere. She, the 6 years of Pryce Hall reduced to 3 rooms and a scullery window. Some evenings he came away from her telling and stood at the library window for a long time, mastering himself, because the things that had been done to her in this house casually, without apparent difficulty, had a way of undoing him that he was still learning to manage, and she let him manage it in his own time, because she recognized the way of people who feel things deeply and need a moment before they can make words of it. He asked her to marry him, in the library one February afternoon, with the white streak fully returned and the compass sitting on the shelf between 2 books, where she had placed it on the day she came home. He did not make a speech. He asked her directly, the way he had asked every important question, simply, watching her face, already certain it mattered. She answered the same way. They were married in April in the parish church, with the whole county present, and Dorinda standing up as bridesmaid, her hands steady and her chin high. Mrs. Kell sat in the family pew by ducal instruction, and wept openly and held Susanna's flowers during the vows, and told everyone who asked that she had earned it. On the wall of the hall at Pryce Hall, where the portrait of Margaret Pryce had hung alone for 23 years, a second portrait was hung beside it in a matching frame. A young woman with dark hair and a white streak above her left temple, painted standing in a library with one hand resting on a shelf of books, and the other closed around a small brass compass. Below the frame, on a brass plate the size of a calling card, 4 words had been engraved at the instruction of the Duke of Keswick, who had specified the wording to the letter cutter and left no room for revision. She came out anyway. It was raining when they left for Keswick House in the late afternoon, which Susanna said she should have expected, and Ronan said he had arranged it, and the white streak caught the gray light through the carriage window and held it, steady and bright, the way it always had. He took the compass from his coat pocket and placed it in her hand, because it was hers, and it had always been hers. And some things given in good faith have a way of finding their way back. The rain drummed on the roof. The lights of Keswick House came up through the gray, warm and steady, at the end of the valley road. Susanna leaned against his shoulder and did not say anything, because there are moments that words only diminish, and she had learned, at cost and thoroughly, which moments those are. Outside, the storm washed the road clean. Inside, her hand was in his, the compass between their palms, going home.